Hello, audience. My name is Dalton Mortimer, and I am the Authenticator. And welcome back to A Mystic's Vlogs, a show where we take a relatively serious look at media with explicit supernatural or fantastical elements through a magical, mystical, mythological, folkloric, paranormal, or occultic lens. And yes, I am finally getting around to the new Chilling Adventures of Sabrina series, much to the anticipation of my colleagues and my friends. So, before we get into this, I probably should establish where I stand on the old Sabrina show and the Sabrina comic, given that that's the auspices behind which this new series comes around. And let's just get this out of the way right now. I'm probably gonna piss everybody off at some point here in this portion of this series in which I cover this, because the old Sabrina series was schlock. It was schlock. It was enjoyable on the same level of a Charmed or a Bewitched when I was younger, but as I have studied the occult and the magics for nearly a decade now, it's one of those things that have become downright insufferable and went from passively bland to downright infuriating in several spots. Also, I'm well aware of the social justice overtones that the new series has, but for the most part, they're either be able to be seen as satirical, or they just didn't bother me all that much because I thought it was the characters that had the social justice issues and vendettas rather than the world or the moral affecture of the show. Thus, it didn't bother me all that much. But, obviously, I wouldn't be covering this if I didn't have something to say, and so I'm not going to be sycophantically praising this series either, because my word, most of the things that it has in common with the old show still piss me right the fuck off, and the new stuff is cringy when it fails to be satirical appropriately, and yes, I'm well aware that the writing staff thought that they were being serious with this shit, and the fact that it came across as B-movie schlock and satirical in the same way the old Charmed series was is probably not a good sign, but let's move on anyway. Because all things considered, I'm probably positioned in just about the perfect place to cover this critically, being as I have somewhat mixed feelings about the old show, am a millennial, am a nerd par excellence, an occultist, and an anti-SJW. So, without much further ado, how about you, show? You may witch me with your best shots. And being as I just did basically the rhetorical equivalent of slapping this show with a white glove and challenging it to a duel, I feel it is my responsibility as a gentleman fighting a duel to give this show its best shake. So let's cover some of the good stuff first, then. The tone and aesthetics of the show all sit comfortably somewhere between the Raul Julia incarnation of the Addams Family to Beetlejuice and Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat. That's one of the reasons why it was so easy for me to see a lot of the more over-the-top cartoony elements as comedic, because it was going for a very over-the-top, very self-aware, very in-on-the-joke, and very comedic tone. To what extent it was successful with that is, of course, a matter for debate. I mostly found it effective, except when they tried to be too heavy-handed, which we'll get into, and when they tried to be something other than mildly entertaining, which we will also get into. The character acting is superb, given that they have almost nothing to work with. The new Hilda and Zelda are very good and very interesting. Zelda is very upper crust and posh, as she should be, considering that in the old show she was always the quote-unquote smart one, and she is always very into the whole being a proper witch thing. Hilda is more the dark satanic equivalent of Mary Poppins for the most part, and I kind of like that. They're both British archetypes, but they're divergent British archetypes. And yes, I'm aware they stole shit from Cain and Abel, from Sandman. And no, show, no, you are not allowed to. You are fighting way above your pay grade on that one. You do not deserve to be mentioned in the same sentence with the Sandman, and fuck you for it. Ambrose is by far and away, at least in this first episode, my favorite character, considering he is having so much fun, and he seems like the kind of person that if I was to hang out with a satanic warlock, he's the kind that I would probably hang out with. Not to mention that, for one thing, he kind of reminds me of a friend I knew in college who was actually a Luciferian, which is hilarious. And I always got a kick out of the fact that he used to be Merlin on the Once Upon a Time TV show, and I kept thinking to myself in my head, gee, what a downgrade, lol. New Sabrina does a good job of appearing well-intentioned and extremely naive, which I think is part of the point. The main villain, who is played by Michelle Gomez, who we will get into as she shows up, is very, very good, and I couldn't help but see her as an extension of the Mistress that she played in Doctor Who. It was very good to see her play a villain again. I always enjoy her playing a villain. Um, Ra- Harvey Roz and Zelda, or Harvey Roz and Susie are all just kind of there. They're the human characters that the more interesting characters bounce off of, in the same way as you would often get on an Addams Family or a Beetlejuice. So, yeah, if you're going to copy that kind of aesthetic and that kind of tone, you're going to unfortunately land the same sort of problems, and that's just how that works, unfortunately. But all things considered, it was fine. I didn't really particularly give a damn about many of them, but I also didn't dislike them except when they were spouting social justice, which was kind of the point, considering that once again I think it was the characters and their status as naive millennials that made it more so than the moral affecture of the TV show. It's not like a Once Upon a Time where the show itself and the universe itself have a very clear moral bias. So yeah, screw just all the things there. But it didn't bug me too much. And with that, I've exhausted all of my ability to say positive things about this show, and we probably should get into the episode proper, so yeah, let's get into that. And let's begin with some of the mistakes that are repeated over and over and over again systematically that I probably should address here and now so that it doesn't get boring later when I have to bring them up constantly. And so let's begin with one of the failings of the original show, the tendency to refer to every single non-witch as a quote-unquote mortal. And this obviously isn't something that's limited just to the Sabrina franchise. Bewitched does this, Potter does this, a bunch of B-rate fantasy shows and movies do this. So let's just get this out of the way right now, shall we? Magic is not a genetic fluke. It is a skill and a scholarly, intellectual study. Yes, blood magic is a thing. And in this instance, I probably should point out that blood magic can refer to many things. It can refer to magic that draws most of its energies from blood. It can refer to binding spells that relate to the blood directly. Or in this case, it can refer to the tendency for an experienced magician's blood to essentially contain slightly more life energy than the average person, and also their practices to alter them on a metaphysical level, an alteration that they can pass on down their bloodline, resulting in what in D&D terms would be termed a sorcerer. And yes, I do have a slight fixer for this that I use on all of these franchises, namely what I call convenience magic. Which is to say that very much in the same way that if you give a population advanced technology and don't explain to them how it works on a regular basis, they will eventually become so accustomed to it that they will forget how it works. The same might be true for magic, both in this show and in all of the other ones I've listed. They've essentially gotten so accustomed to their innate blood magic that they no longer have any recollection of how magic actually functions. So to them, it is a natural gift to such a degree that they don't actually have to learn how to harness it in the same way that a novice or a self-taught like me having to learn it from scratch would. But that still doesn't excuse the whole half witch, half mortal thing, because of course, witches are mortal in the sense that they are capable of being killed. Yes, they have extremely long lifespans in this series and are extremely difficult to kill, but they are still humans. It's not a different species. They're not mutants. It's essentially a bunch of their ancestors did the work, so they didn't have to, and they've forgotten how it actually functions. And fine. But it's even more confusing when you consider that they still have to go through the process of basically becoming the medieval conception of witches, i.e. someone who has bartered their soul away to a demon, and so on and so forth. Which they do a pretty decent job of, I'm not gonna lie. There's even the signing their name in blood in the Devil's Black Book thing that is actually depicted in several medieval and Renaissance paintings, so yeah. There's exceptions to them doing it well, which we'll get into. And then, of course, there's the whole Satan issue. Yeah, that's gonna have to be a rant unto itself. And let's get into that, shall we? Because, of course, as I said, they want very much to appeal to the medieval conception of witches. Malleus Maleficarum, the whole bit. But they do this by incorporating elements of modern Satanism into their mystical system, along with some of the more New Agey aspects of Wicca and Neopaganism. The problem is that Satanists, and yes, I'm aware how counterintuitive this is going to sound, don't believe in Satan. See, Anton LaVey, the founder of modern Satanism, believed that Satan was essentially a Jungian or Campbellian construct, much in the same way as Jordan Peterson believes in God. Which is to say that they believe that the devil is the psychological embodiment of hedonism and free will and primal animalistic nature and so on and so on and so on. They do not believe that the devil is a real entity in Satanism. Satanism is, for lack of a better term, the slightly more serious cousin of movements like Pastafarianism and Kyrgyzstan. They don't believe in Satan per se, they use Satan as an archetype, and also they borrow and pervert Catholic rites just to troll the shit out of Christians. It's counterintuitive, but there it is. And before you get into it, no, Wiccans don't generally, emphasis on generally, believe in the devil either. Because to them, any animalistic or primal aspects of their deities can easily be incorporated into their deities. Because being pagans and Wiccans, their gods are capable of moral agency, both good and evil. Gods in pre-Christian or non-Abrahamic faiths tend to not be morally binary. They have complexities unto themselves and can choose which side of themselves to use. Thus, it's kind of laughable to see them throw in all of this devil shit when they very clearly borrowed shit like the dark baptism and things of that nature from Satanism, and very clearly borrowed a lot of their magics from Wicca and neo-paganism, and most versions of that don't have a devil per se. There's gods of chaos, but there is no devil. And of course, they do incorporate certain aspects of proper dark magic, that being Goshic magic, which is the sort of darker cousin of theurgy. Theurgy being the ability through high magic to invoke divine spirits, and Gosha generally being lower spirits, be they jinn, demons, or fairies. So yeah, you've completely fucked up how anything is supposed to work here, show. And I'm gonna try to keep it to this episode, but later on you utilize something of Aleister Crowley's Thelema, which is the statement, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Although that's in episode 2, so I'm gonna save it for episode 2, and we're going to just stick to what we're presented with here. If you want to know more on the topic of Satanism, which I can't really speak with much more authority than I already have on, because I've not and never have been a Satanist, I highly recommend the videos of the YouTuber Styx Hexenhammer 666. He has several videos on this topic, including a video that explains why he left Satanism on the grounds that it wasn't very metaphysically satisfying and was basically just a troll religion. So, if you want to know more about this, go there to someone who knows a bit more than I do about this shit. But enough dilly-dallying and literal devil's advocacy. Let's actually get into the episode. The only reason I let this go this long is because the series has several repeating mistakes, and it's easier for me to get it all out in one go rather than constantly, repeatedly bringing it up as and when they appear. So anytime one of the characters calls a non-witch a mortal, or they make a satanic reference, just replay that rant in your head, and hopefully that will cover most of the things that I don't address otherwise. In future, it's probably a good idea to keep in mind that every new show we cover on this series is likely to have its own flavor and its own rules, which will require specific concessions or specific rants as needed. So I'm not going to worry so much about the ones that introduce new series to be longer just by virtue of the fact that, well, there's a lot of setup, especially if it's an ongoing series, and there's repeating issues with it. So, yeah. So now I no longer have to feel guilty over the introductory ones being longer. Fuck you. Huzzah. The episode's issue of the day, such as it is after the character introduction bullshit, which I've sufficiently covered already, so skip, is twofold. First, Sabrina is all anxious about taking her dark baptism, which they puff up to surreal proportions of weightiness and ominousness while simultaneously being giddy like schoolgirls the whole time. And two, she is looking for a familiar. And here is where we have more to say on the subject of familiars in particular. Once again revisiting the medieval understanding of the term, a familiar was said to be a spirit, usually a demon in the medieval mind, of course, because of Christianity, that would serve a witch after their soul had been bartered away to the devil, and would serve as a primary servant and a protector and usually a means of magic in their own right. However, the actual impetus behind familiars is something that we find in not only witchcraft in most forms and folk magic in most forms, but also most forms of shamanism. It's an animal companion, yes, but one that is meant to essentially be a co-magician, a companion on the various mystics' paths, as it were. It's not simply a pet. Not every pet can be a familiar. there has to be a particular incline towards mystical aptitude that is not displayed in every animal. Believe me, I've learned this one the hard way. I tried making at least 3 of my cats my familiar before I managed to find one that was actually somewhat mystically inclined. And yes, I incorporated my cat into my magical practice. What of it? Sue me. And yes, while a literal animal is most common among choices for familiars, I have heard stories of people binding lesser spirits or angels into service and calling them their familiars, although I think that in this instance the term is slightly misapplied, given that you can summon a creature and even bind it to you without having that kind of connection to it, so it's sort of hollow, and I prefer these terms maintain their meanings if it's all the same to everyone else. In the Sabrina show, though, it's made very clear that the familiar is a goblin by nature who takes on an animal form for the purpose of being more useful and more able to be conspicuous without drawing a bunch of confused stares. Which does raise the question, are we going with the are we going with the Christian or monotheistic definitions of fairies as well that I covered in my previous uh, episode on the second episode of Legends of Tomorrow, or are we going with the more accurate nature spirit definition? Because if it's the nature spirit definition, then we have officially established that magic can come from places other than the quote-unquote Dark Lord, and if it is the medieval definition, then we have officially confirmed that this is just a pissing match between God and the devil. And quite frankly, I have better things to do with both of my actual spiritual life and my TV viewing time than worry about a god with a god complex and an angel with fucking daddy issues. One thing's for sure, this leads to the first sign that Sabrina is not only a likable character, potentially, but also a pretty competent witch, considering that unlike her fellows in the witch community of this series, she actually wants to do her familiar summoning the old-fashioned way rather than buy things out of a catalog, which brought to mind to me nothing so much as that scene in Halloween Town when Aggie tries to make witch's brew with a microwave. That's what I get for trying to use instant, lol. And also how she kept insisting that much in the way that a familiar should actually be, her familiar was meant to be a partner and co-magician, as opposed to insisting upon a master and servant dynamic in the same way that Zelda does. So, yeah, it was her first likable moment in the entire series. And yes, I know there were moments before then that we were supposed to like her, but those were so comedically over the top and or social justicey that I couldn't be bothered to give a fuck. So, I care about her ability to be likable, A, as a person, and B, as a witch. And she effectively did that in this first episode. So, well done, show. I do wish, though, that it hadn't come quite so much at the expense of Zelda's initial likability, though, because for A, what little nostalgia I have of her original show appearance, and B, her upper crust snooty attitude that I could easily see myself liking, this whole I'm superior to those that work for and with me in my magical practice attitude of hers really did not endear me to her very much at all. And that's a shame. But let's move on to the actual summoning scene where Sabrina summons her familiar because I have things to say, and also it'll lead into our next magical topic, namely when she's summoning it and she gets cursed by 3 witch bitches. For starters, she does cast a circle, albeit a very simplistic and low magical one. And this already puts her a touch above John Constantine in most cases, so good on you, dear. And for another, her spell predominantly focuses around a bell, which of course has some precedent in various different kinds of folklore and magical practices, because of course sound is largely considered able to manipulate the energies of magic, and certain frequencies of it can manipulate it in certain ways. And, the lore about every time a bell rings, a spirit is nearby, be it a fairy or an angel or a demon, so on and so forth. So there was some thought at least put into this ritual, although she says it's from a grimoire called the Demonomicon, which, while to the best of my knowledge not an actual grimoire, grimoires tend to be very high magical in nature, and this was very clearly a low magical rite. So it's a bit confused, much like a lot of the lore in this show. But I'll give them this one, considering that it doesn't really necessarily work at first anyway, which tend to be the case with sloppy rituals. So maybe that was intentional. And of course, when the familiar finally does show up, it transforms from a rather ominous looking goblin thing to a little pretty kitty who is, of course, Salem, who we all know from the original show and the comics. Although in both of those, he was a warlock who was turned into an animal for punishment of some type, much like in the same way Ambrose is bound to the house in this series. But in this one, he's her familiar, and I kind of like it that way. It makes a hell of a lot more magical sense, and also a lot more character sense. And also, he's very, very cute, and cute gets you a lot of places with me. So, okay. He doesn't appear in his goblin form often enough for me to really make comments about this series and its relation to goblin lore, considering goblins tend to have a wide range of appearances, and that's really all I would have to go off of. He's reasonably smallish, which is fitting for a goblin, and so there's really nothing more I can say on the matter. Scrolling back a little bit, though, while she's in the middle of her summoning spell, three rather nasty fellow witches show up and they curse her. Which she was standing in the middle of her circle when they did that, so I might have to deduct points for that, considering the entire point of a circle of that type is to protect you in situations like that. So you went and you had her cast a circle. I'm good on you for that, but you forgot how a circle is actually supposed to function, magically speaking. And yeah, so the fuck. And I guess that's sort of all I have to say about that particular scene. But in regards to the curse removal, she tries to just wash it off for a bit, and that pisses me off because even a minor curse wouldn't be able to be washed off that way unless it was sanctified or stall water. So unsurprisingly, it doesn't work. Although they say it's a blood curse, which is even more complex. But all things considered, it's over fairly quickly, considering that Hilda identifies it with some kind of folk magic, and then prescribes a fairly bog standard cleansing spell for it, which involves repeated bathing in sanctified salt water with some herbs and reversing candles, and all was well and good, so it was fine. And there was some interpersonal drama with Sabrina finding out things about her parents, which led her into sort of the last leg of the main plot, which is trying to use some kind of augury called the Malum Malice to look into the future and see what happens as a result of her baptism. And with that, the villainess, played by Michelle Gomez, tries to interfere with the use of a golem, and said golem is eaten by Salem, which was honestly kind of adorable. Um, I'm not sure to what extent that the golem abides by standard rules because it looked to be made out of clay and everything, which is fairly standard for a golem, but it was controlled by a puppet, which is not fairly standard for a golem, so they're kind of playing a bit fast and loose with the rules. But anyway, that's the crux of the A plot. She bites the malum, it jumps ahead to the ominous bit of the last episode very clearly, and there's nothing really left otherwise. And then she gets a visit from the high priest because, of course, her aunts are worried about her and worried she won't go through with the dark baptism. But considering the next episode is called The Dark Baptism, I don't think they have too much to worry about. And that pretty much concludes the A plot, so I'll go into a brief sort of summation of the B plot quick, and then we will be done, I believe, with this episode. Though before that, I guess a brief mention of things relating to the Malum Malice, because that warrants a mention. Um, it's very obviously a play on the fruit of knowledge, because of course it is. And most augury involving apples involves slicing into the apple and allowing the apple to quote unquote reveal things to you by the way it's sliced or what appears in the apple's heart once it's sliced rather than biting into it. So they got that wrong again, and that's really all I have to say about that. The B plot, such as it is, revolves around Sabrina's friends getting harassed in a very cartoonish and over-the-top, very social justice way, which made me snicker and chortle and laugh the whole time. And then she curses the principal so that he will take some days off, and Ambrose helps. Ambrose is really very quickly becoming my favorite character because he is the family bookworm in this show, and also he's just generally a reasonably cool character. In regards to the spiders, they're said to be Hilda's familiars, which I thought it was a bit weird that she has multiples, but then again, I guess if your familiars happen to be tiny, you might want to invest in more than one, so maybe that's why. Um, I wasn't really sure if the spell that she cast on the principal was a spell to make him go mad, and thus the spiders that appeared in his home were projections and hallucinations, or if she basically gathered up a horde of spiders with magic, and that's what made him go insane. I don't think it particularly matters, but that was just an ambiguity in the spell that I didn't particularly care for. And also, side note, I don't particularly care for the English spells. Like, all of the spells thus far have been English rhymes, and this is just a personal gripe for me. I don't particularly like English spells. I find that other languages have a better mystic resonance, and it's just easier to evoke energy that way. But that's entirely a cosmetic issue that I have, and not a objective magical assessment, so I'll keep it to a minimum. And yeah, apart from that, there's a lot of very cringy dialogue, including the worst bit of it in this episode was when they were naming their women's advocacy club and called it Wicca, which stood for Women's Intersectional Cultural and Creative Association. First of all, it's very obvious that you just wanted the acronym to spell Wicca. Second of all, Wicca is probably the most light-hearted woo that you can possibly get in the magics, so you were just trying to appeal to Wiccans, weren't you? And this confuses me slightly. Thus, yeah, I'm minorly confused by the just sheer, I hesitate to call it cringe because I hate when people refer to things as cringe as opposed to explaining why they're annoying. But yeah, I couldn't tell in spots whether it was supposed to be satirical or not. But even if it was being satirical, that was just a little bit too heavy-handed. It was, "Ma witchcraft and ma social justice are the same, derp derp derp." And even if you could manage to make that joke work, and they do from here and there, yeah, sometimes you just go too hard in the paint, and yeah, that was too hard in the paint. Fuck you. Apart from that, there really wasn't much to be said, other than the fact that the villainess, uh, the name of her familiar is Stolas, who is a demon from the Ars Gotia, and I didn't think that she deserved that. So screw you, show. Yes, I know who she is. I've seen the last episode, but not even Lilith deserves Stolas as a familiar. Fuck off. As you can tell, I'm rapidly losing my patience with this episode, hence why I'm rambling slightly more than usual. But in that light, I think I'm gonna end it here because I don't want to bore you guys to tears, and I think I've already done that probably once or twice already. Anyway, so in regards to my thoughts on the very first episode, yeah, it's a likable enough show that I can see watching it and reviewing it. So that's all that really matters. Um, Other than that, though, yeah, everything I said stands for its own merit, and I'm gonna end it there before I ramble any further. So I will see you all at the next mystic juncture, and cheers, everyone. I will see you all next time.